So, a story that's been making waves lately comes from a place you might know for its peaceful beaches, not its geopolitics. We're talking about the Solomon Islands, a small Pacific nation that just signed a security deal with China. And well, that single act set off a whole lot of alarm bells, especially in places like Australia and the United States. So you've got to ask, right? Why? Why would a small island nation make a move that it knew would upset its traditional, very powerful neighbors? Let's dig into what's really going on behind this deal because it tells us a lot about a huge shift that's happening in global politics right now. All right, so let's get into it. To really get a handle on this deal, we first need to understand why the Solomon Islands was even in the market for a new security partner. And it turns out the country is dealing with a ton of pressure at home. You really have to see the whole picture here. The country's got a potential election coming up, they're gearing up to host the massive Pacific Games in 2023, and on top of all that, they've been hit by a series of really violent protests. The government felt it needed help to keep things stable, and they basically said their existing security agreement with their longtime partner Australia just wasn't cutting it anymore. It was inadequate. And that's where this new deal with China comes in. It lets China send police, maybe even military personnel, to help keep social order. But, and this is the part that really made everyone sit up and pay attention, it also opens the door for Chinese naval ships to make port visits for supplies and stopovers. Yeah, as you can probably guess, the reaction from Australia and its allies was swift. And it was intense. They immediately saw this as a possible Trojan horse. You know, a first step toward a permanent Chinese military base, just a stone's throw from Australia's coast. And some of their reactions were, frankly, pretty wild. The editor of a well-known Australian business publication actually wrote that Australia should just invade the Solomon Islands and force a regime change. I mean, that's how seriously some people were taking this. Now, the official word from the United States was a little more diplomatic, but the message was just as clear. The White House put out a statement basically warning that if a permanent Chinese military presence was established, the U.S. would have, quote, significant concerns and respond accordingly. So let's be real. The message couldn't have been clearer. Australia and the U.S. had drawn a red line in the sand. A Chinese military base in the Solomon Islands, that was something they were just not going to allow. But this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because that whole idea of a red line has been a huge deal in another major conflict recently, but the way the West has talked about it there is, well, let's just say it's completely different. Okay, so just look at the contrast here. For years, the official Western line on Ukraine has been they are a sovereign nation. They have the absolute right to choose their own alliances, like NATO, and Russia's so-called red lines don't matter. But then, when the Solomon Islands exercises its sovereign right to pick a new partner, suddenly Australia and the U.S. are drawing their own red line, telling a sovereign nation what is and isn't acceptable for the region. It's a striking contradiction. Which brings us right back to our original question. Why did this even happen? Why did the Solomon Islands feel like it had to look for a new partner, leaving Australia behind? Well, as it turns out, a big part of the answer is Australia itself. You know, leaders in the Pacific have been shouting from the rooftops for years that climate change is their number one, quote, grievous security threat. But they feel like Australia just hasn't been listening. On top of that, you've got accusations that Australian leaders have been insulting and condescending. And then, the real kicker, when Australia, the US, and the UK formed that big AUKUS security pact to get nuclear submarines into the Pacific, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands apparently found out about it by reading the news. Ouch! Now, let's add another layer of delicious complexity to this whole thing. Take a quick look at Australia's top trading partners. It's not even close, folks. China is number one by a country mile. We're talking about a massive economic relationship that has made a lot of people in Australia very, very wealthy. So this leads to a pretty ironic question that the Australian media itself started asking. Australia is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on defense, right? And a big reason for that is to protect its trade routes in the region. So, who exactly are they protecting all that trade from? That's right. They're spending a fortune to protect their trade with China from China. It's this incredible paradox that just perfectly sums up how tangled and weird modern geopolitics can be. So let's zoom out for a second. Because what this one deal with one tiny island nation is really showing us is a much bigger story. It's about a fundamental shift in global power and about new choices appearing on the world stage. For a long time, smaller nations didn't have a whole lot of options for international partners, but that whole dynamic is changing. So when a traditional partner like Australia doesn't seem to be listening to their biggest concerns, like climate change, well, China is right there offering an alternative. Through its huge Belt and Road Initiative, it's ready to fund projects, broker deals, and yeah, even provide security. All of this gives smaller nations a kind of leverage they've never had before. So what's the bottom line here? The big takeaway? This wasn't just about China being ambitious. You could argue that Australia's actions, or its inaction, created a vacuum. They kind of dropped the ball. And China was right there, ready and willing to pick it up. It's a huge lesson for any major power. If you don't listen to your partners, you better believe someone else will. And that all leaves us with one last, big question to chew on. As the global chessboard keeps changing and power shifts around, who actually gets to decide what sovereignty really means? Is it some universal right that every nation gets? Or is it just a principle that powerful countries apply when, and only when, it's convenient for them? Definitely something to think about.